First of all, I'm David Herrick. I'm with a company called EthicOne, and think of us as the marketing and communications arm of Ethisphere. So we do things like benchmarking best practices in ethics, communications, and marketing. We do strategic consulting, and we do lots of content development. So ethics-related thought leadership, writing, video, etc. And we'll be doing a couple things here today. One is we're going to give you a summary of some research that our panelists have and their companies have participated in, as well as other world's most ethical companies. We'll give you an overview of ethics in marketing and communications. And then I've got a distinguished panel to talk through some questions, talk through some of the findings here, as well as to take questions from the audience. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on slides because that's not what you're here for, but hopefully we'll engage in some good conversation today. So before I get started, I want to introduce the panel. We'll start at the far end with Chris Pugsley, who manages global communications at Semiconductor, large global manufacturer based in Phoenix, Arizona. And she is, to her left, is Sunny Cave, who is Chief Compliance and Ethics Officer, Chief Risk Officer, and Corporate Secretary, and I believe also I mentioned General Counsel, right? Okay. So he wears a lot of hats at Semiconductor. So today we'll hear from both the communication side of that company as well as the compliance and ethics side. In the middle of the table is Paul Gennaro, and Paul is Chief Brand and Communications Officer at Voya Financial, which many of you know, a 4-year-old company now, I believe, and used to be called ING Americas. So they went through a brand transition there, and we can talk more about marketing at Voya. And then finally, Dana Ripley, who is Chief Communications Officer of U.S. Bank, technically U.S. Bank Corp, I guess, would be the parent, the 5th largest commercial bank in the country. So these are people on the front lines of communications, compliance, at world's most ethical companies, and they all participated in the research that we'll talk about. So I want to take you through, and I won't spend a lot of time on the slides. What I will say is there's a summary of this report that you can download in a PDF at EthicOne.com. So make it one word, EthicOne.com, and you can read a summary of the results and get more information there. But here are the highlights. So when you look at marketing and communications in the context of ethics and compliance, these functions do 3 very important things. One, they help build culture in the company. They help communicate what are the values of this company and what do they mean to you as an employee, as a partner of our firm, as a consumer, and as a stakeholder, investor, regulator, etc. And they're the ones who are charged with creating brand understanding and engagement with that brand. So all of these are critical to the ethical enterprise. So the purpose of this study, when we looked out there, there are myriad studies about consumers want to choose ethical companies, they want to choose ethical brands. There are things like the Deloitte Millennial Study have gone into this. Pew has done a lot of research. We heard about the Edelman Trust Barometer at the World's Most Ethical Gala last night. But none of these studies yet, as best we know, have dived into, well, what are the practices inside companies, inside the world's most ethical companies, that we might be able to model and share with others. So that's what we intended to do. So we looked at the whole 135 world's most ethical companies from 2018, went into the data related to communications, marketing, culture. We also had 8 companies who stepped forward to sort of open the suit jacket and show us inside their marketing and communications functions and we did a deep dive with them. We looked at ethics, values, trust, and transparency. So, what did we find? We found I'll talk about three big themes here today. The first is, in all of these companies, there was absolutely impeccable CEO leadership. CEOs were leading the charge on ethics. In fact, when we looked at C-suites and boards, every participant in our smaller panel said that they were either they were more engaged with these issues of ethics, trust, and values than they were 3 years ago, or in many cases significantly more engaged. No company said, it's about the same or a little less engagement. So this is rising on the agenda for top management of companies. In all of these companies, the CEO was the spokesperson, the chief spokesperson for ethics in that company. They were supported by a broad team of senior leaders in the companies. And I'd say that these are clustered. The really high ones are general counsel, chief legal officer, head of HR. We had business unit leaders were pretty high on the chart, but a broad team. And I'd say the companies who are doing it best are engaging their entire senior leadership in being messengers for ethics and values in their companies. They also talk about it a lot. Ethics and compliance isn't a once a year or upon hire or onboarding type of issue for them. They're talking about it monthly or more frequently in most cases, or at least quarterly to their employee base. And some of these are big companies. When we looked at all 135 world's most ethical companies, one thing we found is that they do storytelling. So ethics isn't just about that 10-point checklist or that long document that you supposedly expect every employee to read. No, it's about leaders connecting with real-world examples of how they confront ethics challenges, how they have personally, how they've dealt with them, grappled with them. And this is a key to being effective in terms of building culture and understanding about ethics and compliance. So the second thing we found was that there was very active board engagement in all of these companies when it came to ethics. And again, CEOs really engage with their marketing leaders, we found. So in all of these companies, they supplied reports to their board at least quarterly on ethics and compliance, and in some cases monthly, which is fairly frequently. And we'll talk a little bit about the experience of our panelists in terms of their board involvement on these issues. We also found that CEOs of these companies engaged with their communications and marketing leaders on a very frequent basis, for the most part, on these issues. So when you look at the head of communications and PR, this is daily and weekly. They are engaging on issues of ethics, trust, values, and transparency. So CEOs, as you know, don't spend a whole lot of time doing things that they don't think are valuable. And in this case, they're really spending time with these top leaders on the issues that you all care about. The board is not the exclusive sandbox anymore of the CEO, and in fact, they're bringing in many cases, their marketing and communications leaders to interact with the board on these issues, and we can talk with our panelists about how that's happening. But the top corporate communications or public relations leader and the top marketing or brand leader, they're having, for the most part, the majority are having interaction themselves with their company's board of directors. Finally, communications about ethics and transparency and values in these companies we studied became a codified business process. It was a way that they did business. It wasn't an afterthought. And some of the data points about that, 96% of world's most ethical companies actually have a documented compliance and ethics plan. So you don't codify and act on something that isn't important in the company. There is a deep commitment across the company to ethics and values. So what we found is that managers in the vast majority of companies are expected to talk with their employees about ethics and values. And in the case here in the green, it's typically, well, we don't ask every manager to do it, but we have our directors do it. So the takeaway here is it's enterprise-wide. It's not just senior leaders talking about ethics. It's making the whole company accountable for it. We're also finding that these companies have ways to engage external audiences in a real dialogue with the company. And I think we'll find over time that this dialogue and the intensity of it will increase. But most companies, as you see in the middle, have a process to fast track and review and disseminate communications of the company. So when you think about, here we are talking about ethics in the lightning quick social media age, you not only have to be right with the information you share with the public, but you got to be quick. Because your reputation may not last a week if you sit there. So what these companies are doing is they're finding ways to have cross-functional teams that can fast-track communications and get good communications to audiences that matter in near real time. Finally, these companies understand their trust position with their customers. So by and large, they have a near real-time view of where do we stand on trust? Is it going up or down this week, this month? And what are the levers we need to pull to do something about it? So they measure and they evaluate. So I want to have a panel conversation here now about some of these issues. But I'll leave you with these 4 takeaways. Number 1, leadership is critical. If you want to have an ethical company, it's not just going to start at the grassroots and bubble up to the CEO. It has to be a board and CEO and management team commitment to that. It's got to be enterprise-wide. We can't talk about it occasionally at the senior leadership level if there's a different reality in your plant, in your office, in another market. It has to be the whole company. CEOs and boards need to actively engage, not just the compliance officers, but their marketing and communications leaders on these issues. And finally, ethics and values have to be coded into the DNA of the company, how you operate, making it a regular business process. So there's a lot more in the summary that you can find, again, at EthicOne.com. I encourage you to do that. If you have questions, feel free to email me about findings in that study. Would be happy to share any thoughts that I have. But what I do want to do before I go further is just thank some of the founding participants who helped to make this research possible. So in addition to On Semiconductor, US Bank, and Voya, we had 3M step up to do this, and several other companies participated in the research, so we thank them for helping us to make this happen. I know it's not easy for companies to share in depth, and they did. We told them, hey, look, we're not going to identify you, so tell us the truth. Tell us what's happening. Tell us what you're really doing well and where there are opportunities. And they did. So we found it to be invaluable and hope to expand it later this year. So with that, I want to jump into some questions and get the panel talking, and then we want to take audience questions in the second half of this. So I'm going to start with you, Sunny. All right. We talked a little bit about the importance of board interaction and how they engage with ethics and compliance. So can you talk a little bit about your perspectives at On Semiconductor and how your board engages on this issue?
Sure. Thank you. I appreciate being here. Just to give a little bit of perspective to my perspective, I'm the founding general counsel at On Semiconductor, so I've been in that role for 20 years. So I've seen the board during that entire time. We were a spin-out from Motorola. Originally, we're owned by a private equity firm. So we have come a long way on engagement with the board, particularly with ethics and compliance issues. So in terms of let's count the ways, starting at the awards dinner last night, we had 1/3 of our board attending at the table, 3 members of the board. We actually have one of our members in the audience here today, Christine Yan, and we appreciate her staying for the summit and learning along with us, with the whole compliance and ethics team. Some of the other things that we do for board engagement with our compliance and ethics program, we have a global summit every 2 years, it's a biennial event where we bring together all of the compliance and ethics and corporate social responsibility professionals in the company. And that event is now, well over 100 people. When we first started doing that a number of years ago, I had this idea, let's have a member of the board come to the summit. I have to tell you a little story on that because it was somewhat controversial. Do we want to have a board member come to a 3-4 day event? And some people were like, well, then they're going to see all the stuff under the hood, and I'm not so sure they're going to. I said, no, we need to embrace it. This is exactly what we need to have. So we have had a member of our board of directors come every year that we've had this global summit. They've stayed through the entire event. They deliver a keynote speech, and one of the things we do is we also arrange small group meetings, breakfast, lunch with the people who are attending from the company, to have an opportunity to sit and talk with the member of the board who is there. Ask any questions. We tell them that there's no boundaries. You can ask whatever you want. So the level of board engagement, I think, is critical to the success of a program. It's paid a lot of dividends, I think, with us, and particularly the compliance and ethics professionals. They feel I'm actually connected, not just to the CEO and other people on the executive team, but the board of directors and who they are and what they represent. The other thing I'll say, because of course we do a lot of all the standard quarterly reporting to the board, but our board is very highly engaged in culture. So we've heard that in all of the talk last night and all the presentations this morning. This is something that didn't always exist in the company, but the company's culture and what it means and who we are and what we're made of and whether we have the right stuff as a culture to fulfill our strategic objectives and all of our corporate planning is now a regular occurring agenda item at every board meeting. And that is something that's very phenomenal. We're starting to also bring the board in a little bit more on quoting them directly in our communications. And Chris will talk a little bit more about that. We're looking at even moving into video messaging and so forth. So Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. So just one more question on this, on this board theme. So Dana, you, as a large bank, risk is evaluated, right? And you've told us that you interact with the board on issues of risk. So can you tell us about risk and reputation risk in particular?
Yeah, so as a large bank, we're highly regulated. We have about 20 different regulators that we meet with on a regular basis, including the Fed, the OCC, the FDIC, and so historically, most of the risk that we're evaluated on is financial risk. What clients are we taking on? How much capital are we holding? And I'm sure everybody in this room can relate. Over the past, let's say 5 years, this new risk has emerged, and it's intensifying, and it's reputation risk. And historically, we all manage issues, but we've never kind of put a governance structure in place to manage reputation risk. Now, those 20 regulators, about half of them actually have a reputation risk kind of category that they're monitoring us on. I mean, you understand why if you were just watching the news yesterday and you saw that Wells Fargo's CEO testified before the House Financial Services Committee, and then after he testified, the OCC issued a statement rebuking Wells Fargo, like unprecedented. And that is all that's reputation risk. So our board, and I sit on one of the committees, it's called the Public Responsibility Committee. Our board is starting to focus on reputation risk. This is new for them, and they're asking people like me, what should I be worried about? And they're asking for a greater line of sight into the reputation issues that we're dealing with. And the issues that we're dealing with literally on a day-to-day basis is, what are banks doing about the marijuana industry? It's being legalized in states, it's legal in Canada. I mean, we've got California now, so that's a big part of the population. That's a big piece of our footprint, but we're federally regulated. Federally, marijuana is illegal, so we can't bank these clients. So a lot of complexity and reputation risk, and those are the types of things that the board is asking people like me more about. It's like, these are the issues that really keep the board up at night. They can look at a spreadsheet and understand financial risk. There's no spreadsheet for reputation risk, and things can emerge very quickly.
Thank you. So one quick follow-up. So if there's no spreadsheet for it, how do you evaluate it?
Well, we have a kind of what I call a Doppler system, where we're forecasting kind of the emerging issues. There are issues that we are living with on a day-to-day basis, like the firearms industry, marijuana, cryptocurrency, all those things. But then we're also continuously kind of evaluating the landscape and looking for emerging issues. Mm-hmm. And we have kind of a research process that we put in place to be forecasting. And then we have a tracking system so that the board knows here are the 10 issues that we're really focused on right now.
Okay. So we'll pull this thread of reputation through, Paul, and I'd like to hear from you a little bit about how Voya has sort of extended ethics externally at the company to build your reputation with consumers, how you, I think some of us have seen the world's most ethical company at the logo at the end of your television advertising, but how did you get there? What was the journey you took in evaluating, hey, we want to double down on ethics?
Got it. So the Voya brand was launched in Q4 of 2014. So the companies we're competing with, they have brands that are 200 years, if you look at the different competitors, add them all up, a lot older than us. From the beginning, infused in the brand was the culture and the values of the organization. And so if you think in terms of you've got a new name, and that's great, and you've probably got some good graphics when you launch a brand, but what does it stand for? You've got this empty vessel, and then what you're going to fill that vessel up with as far as what it stands for, you have two choices. Either you're going to do it very proactively, or it's going to happen passively with somebody else doing it, and circumstances are going to kind of come into play. So from the beginning, the company's really emphasized its values and its culture and really looked to differentiate itself. And as far as the way we look at it very holistically. So it's corporate communications, it's branding, advertising, social media, research and insights, everything that we're doing. we try to put the brand forward in a nice, consistent way. From 2015, so I joined January 15 to got near the end of 17, we made really good progress, really exceeded all our brand awareness goals with our target audiences and demographics. So really good news. Within all of the data, you can see the different attributes, so how you're doing. One of the areas that we were lagging on was trust. So if you looked at our trust score versus the peer average, it was a few points below. Now, it's not to be unexpected because how is trust earned? Through experience. So now you've got this relatively new brand that people don't know. Some people do. So to build up trust, experience is probably going to be the way to get you there over time if you're doing the right things. That said, it bugged me. It bugged me because I've been involved with Ethisphere since 2010. I'm on the Ethisphere board. I'm on the board of the Emory University Center for Ethics. And I said, this is something we should really look at. Could we do something with it? So we had this idea. At the end of our broadcast commercials, let's flash up the world's most ethical company logo, and we'll see what happens. So we did that in 2018. And we got about partway through the year, and guess what? Our score that was lagging on the ethics attribute, trust attribute rather, started to go ahead of the peer group. So we said, that's pretty good, that's a good thing. We should keep doing that. The other thing we did is we wanted to dig in. We also had up there at different times, it was World's Most Ethical and Fortune 500. Then in January, we earned World's Most Admired. First time we were invited to participate, we earned it, which we were real excited about, because that's a hard one to get as well. So we had World's Most Ethical and World's Most Admired up there. We ended up using our research group, did an online focus group of about 400 people in our target demographics. So 45 to 64, above 75,000 in income. They asked that group a variety of questions about these logos and what had the most impact. One of the questions was, if you had to choose one, what would be most impactful? Now, if you had asked me to bet money, and I'm not a betting person, I would have said World's Most Admired. That's the Fortune World's Most Admired. That's really tough to get. It was not. It was World's Most Ethical. If you asked them to pick one of the differentiator that would drive your interest in doing business, World's Most Ethical captured 52%, Fortune 500 was 27%, and Fortune Most Admired was only 21%. And there's more detail on it. It's in a Ethisphere article that our CEO did a byline on last year. So if you can't find it on the Ethisphere website, you can email me and I'll share it with you. But it's compelling. We've seen that also in our social media posts. So we'll get out there on social, and I think our team does a very good job from a thought leadership standpoint. If you look at our engagement rate for something about financial wellness or some of the other thought leadership issues you would expect a financial services firm to engage in, they're good. They're good scores. However, if you look at our scores for our engagement scores for things around corporate responsibility or World's Most Ethical or plugging an article like this, they're 2 and 3 times the engagement rate is normal. So what does that tell me? A couple things. One, it tells me that folks, this is something they would find interesting. It's something that's compelling. The big aha for me that World's Most Admired was not the driver is I live in this insular environment of corporate, right? And C-suite, and I work with people like you and we know about Fortune. But if you think of the general consumer, they might have an idea of what Fortune is and what Most Admired is. They may not know what Ethisphere is, but World's Most Ethical, they kind of get that. It's pretty easy to understand. And that drove interest in doing business. So our big takeaway was it's a good idea. We've continued it now along with our advertising campaign that launched this January. I haven't gotten the results back yet, but so far so good, and we're excited.
Okay. Well, that calls up a few questions that we'll hit in a few minutes. I want to go to Chris quickly, though, to talk about, so how do you do this over both a large geographic footprint? How do you communicate about ethics? But also, you're a manufacturing company, but a semiconductor manufacturing company. So you have these highly educated PhDs on the one hand, and then you have people working in your plants around the world. So how do you think about communicating ethics to these diverse audiences?
I was going to say Paul's response ties beautifully into the way I was going to respond to this question. I think compliance and ethics, just like diversity and inclusion, has to tie into your company culture and the DNA of your company, right? It can't be a legal thing. It can't be, oh, the compliance and ethics team said so we have to do it. It really has to be something that your people and your employees feel, right? One of my favorite stories is one of our vice presidents in sales came to me after the first time we won World's Most Ethical. And he said, Chris, and This was a very high-level customer. All of you have heard this customer. They're a Fortune 50 customer. And he said, I'm sitting in this meeting, and the CEO of this customer is showing us slides, right? And one of the very first slides they were showing us is the awards that our company had achieved. And one of them was World's Most Ethical. And high-level salesperson at our company didn't realize how much World's Most Ethical meant until said customer was showing it to us, right? And came into my office super excited that they were showing us all these awards, right? And from then on, as part of our communication plans, we share with them, award slides and things collateral that we can share with them externally to the street, right? We have press releases, packages we can share internally and externally. But it really started resonating internally what it means, right? As part of our sales sheets, automatically what's generated at the bottom is the logo of World's Most Ethical on every single sales sheet. So it's auto-generated now, right? So it's as part of the DNA of the company in various different modes and platforms. One of the other stories I like to share is we had an intern a few years back that was part of the internal communications team. And we take it for granted now, I think, as a company, because it's our 4th year of receiving this designation. And she had since left, went to another company, started working there. We kept in touch. She was a great employee. And she pinged me. I was speaking at a conference in another state, and she said, I'd love to do lunch or dinner with you if you're free. And I made time, met with her. She said, if there's ever an opening, I want to come back. And I said, I'd like to know why. Well, I'm working for another company, and I really understand what ethics is after working for Semiconductor, right? So that's what ethics is. It starts becoming the DNA of the employee. So it's not really how do you tailor it to an engineer versus how do you tailor it to an engineer and a manufacturing employee. It really becomes how every single employee starts interacting with each other. It starts becoming evident in the communications of every employee. Yes, our CEO speaks a certain way and means it. Every single employee interacts with each other a certain way. It's tied into our cultural values. It's tied into our core values, right? And I think as I was reading on the plane, we have a newsletter. It's called The Circuit. I proofread it. This goes to our board. It goes to all of our employees. But we do have pieces on compliance and ethics in here. And we tailor it in a way that it would resonate with each of our employees. It is also translated into major languages that our employees that speak another language natively would understand, right? We have employees that don't speak English. You can't expect them to read an English document and understand what that means, right? Similar to the code or any other document that you're preparing.
Well, thank you. So what we have found in talking with companies is that every company that's a world's most ethical company communicates with their employees about this honor. And some communicate with their customers, and some, a lesser amount, communicate with some of their vendors and business partners, and less with regulators and investors, and it sort of goes like this. So everyone's talking with employees. But what you've indicated, Paul, is that there's a powerful reason to go outside the company and start talking about your ethics and values. But I can imagine some of the conversations that happen in the C-suite about that. Hey, we don't want to go out and put a target on our back. What if we don't live up to them? What if, someone in our company does something stupid somewhere? What's going to happen? And there are 1,000,001 small reasons that people don't get as aggressive as Voya has or US Bank. But you're also conservative institutions as well. You wouldn't be around and as big as you are today. So how do you have those conversations? And I'm curious what they're like internally, and how have you inched out there? So maybe I'll start with you, Dana, and then go to Paul.
Yeah, so as a financial institution, bank, I mean, everybody in this room has a bank account, I'm assuming. So like our trust relationship with all of our customers, whether you're a corporate customer, a small business, a college student, that relationship is built on trust. So our C-suite is very comfortable with being trust forward in everything that we do. In fact, the cover of our last year's annual report was all, the word trust was right there, front and center in red. The other thing that we did, and I credit our CEO, is we built trust into our strategy. So one of our strategic pillars, we have 4 strategic pillars, is to be the most trusted choice. And that means everybody's behaviors and strategic activities tie back to those 4 pillars, including most trusted choice. So it is literally codified into our corporate strategy. And that makes it really easy for us to be trust forward in our external communications. And, as part of my job, I also have oversight for all of government relations. And we go to the Hill and we talk to elected officials, and that's kind of what we lead with. It's like, we're in your district, we're a trusted bank, and here's what we do in your community for your constituents. And the response, as always, is very positive. And frankly, the way we look at it is being a world's most ethical company doesn't mean you're perfect, but it means that you respond to the issues as perfectly as you possibly can. Because we're going to make mistakes. We're a $500 billion bank. We have 20 million customers. There are bad apples out there, and the ethics ties back to the response, not to perfection.
Okay, that's an important point. Paul, so you were around putting that, encouraging that world's most ethical logo to go into a television advertisement. What was, how did you overcome that, and what were some of the objections to that?
Yeah, so I guess a couple things. One, fortunate to work for a chairman and CEO that gets it, so there wasn't that battle there. On the objections, I didn't ask, we just did it.
Okay.
So that kind of,
That's the takeaway.
so that was kind of simple. I guess the way at my previous company though, so if you go back 5 years ago, there was a level of resistance. We got asked that question, do we really want to go out? What happens if one year we don't win it? And I said, well, we'll deal with it at that point. I said, but here's what's going to happen, right? It's increasingly important, and we see this whether it's I want to do business with you, it's the company I want to work for, I want to stay working for, I want to invest in. We're seeing growth in the ESG investing. Tim, who's in the back, talked about that last night. Regulators and legislators, you talked about it on the Hill. This is a big deal, right? And it's something that does matter and should be celebrated. And if you find yourself in a situation where well, first off, it's going to happen. If you've got a large organization, somebody somewhere is going to act like a knucklehead and do something really dumb and stupid, right? How does the organization react to it? Further, and I'll go back, and this is from 2011, I did a webinar with Ethisphere, and it was on this topic. And this is from the SEC sentencing guidelines. So go down the road of some knucklehead somewhere does something wrong. What they take into account is, does an organization promote an organizational culture that encourages ethical conduct and a commitment to compliance with the law? And guess what they look for? The things that the organization puts out there. Does it have a code of conduct that an employee fills out when they start working for the company, and that's the only time in the career, or once a year? Or do they have this ongoing communication that you talked about in the study? So I would argue the time invested in this is the difference between maybe no fine when knucklehead does something versus a $100 million fine. So now it really does get into risk mitigation, and I would argue the risk is not being there. And then the last one I'll share from the data standpoint is, all right, so you do something wrong, and this is from a Hill and Knowlton study on sustainability. Do you believe that a company can regain public trust through an honest and transparent reporting of its efforts to be sustainable, even if that reporting highlights where it falls short? So you're completely honest, but we're not very good. 82% of the respondents said yes. So I think people want that transparency, and there's more and more data out there. These are a couple of points. So I think if folks are running into that, we've got the data, and I think it's a compelling set of data.
That's great. And so one last question, and then I want to open it up to the audience here. But so Sonny, you're in the business of making sure your company steers clear of trouble. So what's your perspective when it comes to being forthright about how ON Semiconductor is an ethical company, a company you should trust?
Yeah, that's a question that gets asked a lot. And so there's this traditional lawyer legal perspective, which often goes along the lines of, we don't want to talk about that. Let's be as circumspect as possible, because why? Well, we might get sued. or that'll become evidence in a lawsuit that already exists. And so, people who are trained as lawyers, that's what they worry about. So early on in my career, I didn't actually always want to be a lawyer, so I came to it later. My attitude is that would be really a rare exception where you would take that approach. There obviously are some times when, the situation might call for that. But generally speaking, transparency is much better. Honesty, integrity, it's our first core value is integrity. And so we want to live up to that. And the communication function and role in a company, the way I look at it is, the evolution of our species as humans, for hundreds of thousands of years, one of the big differentiators is how sophisticated we can communicate, amongst ourselves, as humans. And so why not leverage that in everything that you do? And so with ethics and compliance, we have a company, as Chris described, we have people from all over the world, all different countries, all walks of life. And the communications is the best way to connect the dots for all these people to understand all the different perspectives, all the different things that are important for our company and our culture. It's like a language in and of itself. So to me, it's not really, debatable. It's this fundamental to your success and who you want to be.
Okay, well, thank you. So I want to open it up. I think we'll have about 10 minutes, give or take, maybe a few more, to take questions. So anyone, I see a question here.
So when it comes to marketing your ethics and your culture externally, in addition to putting up the Most Ethical Company logo, what other information do you share, especially for those of us who have not yet achieved that honor? What other kind of information do you put out there? I would imagine it's code of conduct, but do you have other data or statistics that you provide to support the fact that you have an ethical culture or support an ethical culture?
I'll let you go.
We have a blog, so we try at least monthly, if not quarterly. We do have a blog that's posted on our external site, and then we do encourage our leaders to speak at conferences. So similar to this, so we'll do some promotion. One thing that's, I would say, unique to our company, and that's, I think, part of this study as well, we have what's called CELs, Compliance and Ethics Liaisons. So we have about 40, Sunny, right now. They're not part of the legal department. They are also, I would say, like intake to the compliance and ethics program, where they can take in any issues that are coming in for the compliance and ethics program, and then can also take in requests for advice as part of the program. We also have a compliance and ethics committee, which I would consider part of the C-suite level, that aren't part of the compliance and ethics program. So it's like our COO, and then various members of the executive staff that provide any feedback for the program on a quarterly basis. That also, I would say, will start contributing to these blogs and also can speak at events as well that are external, I would consider external facing as part of these blogs or at these engagements. So some of those folks were at the event last night.
I think this is a really important question because you can't really just say that you're an ethical company. You got to have proof points. And Ethisphere is one proof point that we use at US Bank. Our research actually told us that if you go out and tell people that you're an ethical company without backing it up with legitimate proof points, they actually trust you less. Yeah. It's like, look, it's like going out and telling people I'm so good looking, if you have to tell people you're good looking, so Ethisphere is one proof point. Another proof point that we often point to, and she's wandering the halls here somewhere, she's great, she's a chief ethics officer. And so we established that role, 2 or 3 years ago. She's, not necessarily the face of ethics, because we really believe that the CEO is the face of ethics, but she is our champion. And so we do a lot of external communications work around her. And then in just a month or so, we're going to be launching a business ethics resource center. in partnership with the University of St. Thomas. And it's going to be kind of just, you know, a space where business customers can talk about leveraging ethics as a strategic advantage. And it's going to be, you know, we're going to be the sponsor of it, but it's really a neutral territory for everybody just to exchange ideas about how to leverage ethics to strengthen your business. Now, we definitely want some of the goodwill halo that will come from that, so the U.S. Bank brand will be part of it, but it's not going to be you know, dominant U.S. Bank. But things like that help us say, you know, if we're going to be the most trusted choice in banking, here are some compelling reasons why.
Yeah, I just follow that up and say, I think you do need the data points. However, I'd point out, I've given my wife data points on why I'm handsome, and she's not buying it. So. But I think whether you're a world's most ethical company or not, just lay out a calendar like you would for anything and say, what are those things? So world's most ethical is coming up in March. I'm going to have somebody there. We're going to comment on something. We're going to write a byline article. How do you fill out that calendar? We do an ethics week every year. That's a big thing internally. We also share that with the board. We also share that externally. So to the extent that you can build out that calendar, whether or not you get this designation, you can write things for submission to the Ethisphere magazine, and that's very well read. And then once you get that back, that piece of collateral could be leveraged in multiple ways as well.
And it doesn't always have to be like a blog or something directly related to compliance. And I'll give you an example of how we've used or leveraged World's Most Ethical, like the logo, or just tied it into other things. So we have a supplier conference, an external one, every other year. So we've put the World's Most Ethical logo on like a full banner, like what's behind us at the supplier event. Or put something about compliance and ethics in brochures and collateral at external facing events that aren't necessarily tied to compliance and ethics, but it's part of our DNA that we weave into our other collateral.
Just one other thing to add quickly is, so as part of the World's Most Ethical application, about 40% of it has to do with corporate social responsibility. And so that's one that is leverageable quite readily, you know, into communities. And if you happen to be in a business where your products themselves can be utilized, that's also very helpful from an external facing point of view. So we're in semiconductors, and our focus is on power management. So we make things more efficient for use of electricity and conservation. And we're also heavily into image sensors and automotive safety. So it's another way to, you know, tie it into, you know, both your business and the external facing world.
Thank you. Okay, you beat her by an eighth of a second, so we'll get you over here, please.
Thanks so much for all of your comments. Very, very helpful. I wanted to hear a little bit more, maybe if you talk a little bit more about the genesis of how you build those relationships with communications, with marketing. So, you know, as an ethics and compliance officer, you know, do you have some tips for, you know, I imagine a lot of this is relationship driven. How do you, you know, really focus on forging those relationships?
I'll start with that one. So I was the person who recruited Chris into the company. She actually has a paralegal background as well, and so brought her into the law department, and she had a lot of energy, and you know, you could just see it was just bubbling, and in the way she would approach all the different tasks. She has a degree in communications, so an opening came up in the company in communications, and she talked to me about it, and I encouraged her. I said, you really should go for that. I'm a big believer in having people sort of graduate from the law department and go into other parts of the company. It's, you know, I think if you have that intention in mind that you're going to forge the relationship, you'll find the way to do it. We were very blessed to have the situation with Chris coming in and then actually escalating into a much bigger, more important role in the company.
Yeah, so I actually have a dual degree in journalism and sports broadcasting. I figure that most athletes end up going to jail, which is why I did the dual degree. And thought, if I'm on air, I should know what I'm talking about from a legal perspective, which is it ended up working out very well. I actually interviewed in Phoenix on Semiconductor, never knew what a semiconductor was, and 2 other companies, which all of you have heard of. But when I interviewed with Sonny, he was very candid about the semiconductor industry and how cyclical it was. And based on that trust in the interview, I ended up joining the company, even though I knew the industry was cyclical. And talking about relationships and trust, one of the things I think when you're talking about relationships and relationship building, my second language was English. My parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, and I think that's one of the pieces of connectivity and what drove me to the passion of communication. When I go and visit our employees at the manufacturing site, I know that they don't sit there and read all the things that we think is so important from a corporate level, right? They've got things that are so much more important to them, and they're worried about their families when they go home at the end of the day. And the worries that they have are so much different than ours. So I try to connect with them and think about what's more important to them in that value standpoint, and really look at, their values and try to connect with them, right? So building the relationships. We look at things like read rates and read levels when we send out communications at our different sites. So if you have that ability with your communication teams, on average, read rates for emails are 11 seconds. Our company is 53 seconds. So your effectiveness of sending an email to your employees, especially manufacturing, is not going to be there. So if you have the availability to do lunch and learns or videos, that's what's going to be more effective. So when we're looking at compliance and compliance communication, we try to do things in a different way to connect with those audiences and build those relationships, right? It's a lot more effective to have Sunny go to a manufacturing site and connect with those employees than send an email to those employees, right? So that's, talking about relationships and building those relationships, who's going to connect with those employees and what's important to them. And if you have that availability to connect with your comms team at your corporations and really dive into some of those analytics, I would really encourage you to do that.
I wanted to get one question over here, I think. That's right. Yes.
It actually kind of dovetails with the question about how to build those relationships. Because I think some of that, you have to make the business case, right, for why those communications are so important. So I was curious, Paul, when you cited about the commercials and the trust index surveys that showed that the world's most ethical versus admired. Were those internal surveys that you were doing where you measured the impact of those, or were they external? How did you collect that data? Because I think that would be useful in building the business case on why it's so critical.
Yes, I think it's a combination. So we've got, with our advertising agency, we get back data that tells us how's our brand awareness going, and we get that on a weekly basis and a monthly basis and rolling, and we can see what the awareness is and the different attributes. So that was the one measure we were behind. We wanted to get better. It worked. But then we have a consumer research and insights team that's part of our function as well. That team does ongoing measurement. They set up an online community of folks, about 400 folks that fall within our demographics. So that enabled if you think about there's the hard data and then you can dig in and get the qualitative, that enabled a qualitative review of why the data was what it was. I guess the thing I'd say from a question standpoint on the relationships internally, right? What I've seen the last 9 years, right? It used to be communicators weren't that interested in what we're talking about here, but what you've seen, and whether it's PR Week magazine, Arthur Page Society, Public Relations Society of America, this focus on trust and reputation has become more important. Dana talked about it as reputational risk. So I think communicators should have it on their radar. If you're in the compliance and legal side, take them to lunch and say, we've got to talk about this. It's a big deal. It's a business issue. And conversely, if you're a communicator, I'd say go grab your legal and compliance folks and have the same conversation.
We
I
may.
think that I'm sorry, just to follow up, because a lot of that was generated from your, the agencies that you're working with and collecting the data. Is that the statistics that you cited in the article that you referenced? Is that your CEO or whoever wrote?
Yeah, so this is from our data, but I would say if you grab an issue of PR Week magazine, or if you look out there's enough publicly available data in the marketing, brand, and communication space that talks about the importance of reputation and trust and business and the connection of results.
We measure our reputation across a group of about 20 different stakeholders, and we use the Reputation Institute to measure our reputation. And it's everything from our retail banking customers, our small business customers, non-customers, employees, the media, elected officials. I mean, we have literally 20 different stakeholders, and we measure our reputation. So that creates the business case, because it's also kind of measuring the better your reputation, the better your loyalty, which is a direct line to revenue. Because we don't have most trusted choice in our strategy because it just makes everybody feel good. We're doing it because it creates value. It creates value on the revenue front. It creates value on the shareholder front. It creates value for our employees because they feel good about working for the company. They're more engaged. But if you're going to build a communications program around trust and ethics, you have to measure it. You absolutely have to measure it. Otherwise, it's just like mist in the wind.
Yep. And I got the signal that we need to wrap. So I want to thank Chris and Sunny and Paul and Dana and all of you for attending today.
Thank you.